Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, does a locked door ever trouble you more than an open one? A family's secrets, like a sealed drawer, ask only to be understood. Watson learned that a signature too perfect hides more than one too clumsy. Do subscribe, so no forgery escapes your notice. Now, settle by the lamplight. For as Holmes believed, truth outlasts even the most careful deception. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. The link awaits below. Chapter 1. The House of Ashcombe. It was upon a raw and dripping evening in November, when the fog lay so thickly upon Baker Street that the lamps burned like dull orange wounds in a grey and formless sky, that I first heard the name of Harcourt spoken beneath our roof. Holmes had been in a mood of restless inactivity for the better part of a week, his violin lying untouched upon the settee, and I confess I had begun to dread the particular silence that so often preceded one of his darker humours. It was, therefore, with something very like relief that I heard the sharp peal of our bell below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, and the quicker, more agitated tones of a younger man. "A client, Watson," said Holmes, without troubling to rise from his chair, "and an anxious one, if I am any judge of a footstep upon a staircase. Observe how he takes the last 3 steps in a single stride, and yet pauses upon the landing, as though uncertain whether his trouble is worth the telling." The door opened upon a young gentleman of perhaps 25 years, well dressed in the sober fashion of his profession, though his collar was damp and his hat had suffered considerably from the weather. He introduced himself as Mr. Julian Harcourt, barrister and nephew to Sir Reginald Harcourt of Ashcombe Hall in Surrey. "You will forgive my calling at so late an hour, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself upon the edge of the chair I had drawn forward. "But I confess I hardly know where else to turn. My uncle is not a man given to alarm, and yet I have never in my life seen him so shaken as he was this morning." "Pray begin at the beginning," said Holmes, settling back into his chair with his fingertips pressed together in that attitude of attentive repose which I had long ago learned to recognise as the very opposite of indifference. "You will find that I am seldom impatient with details, however trivial they may appear to you." Our visitor drew a folded paper from his breast pocket, though he did not immediately offer it. "My uncle," he said, "is a man to whom the name of Harcourt is very nearly a religion. We are an old family, Mr. Holmes, though not, I think, a remarkable one, save for the peculiar authority which a trust created by my grandfather placed in my uncle's hands. He controls the disposition of certain properties among the relations, and his word upon questions of family history has never once been doubted. It is that word, sir, which now stands in the gravest jeopardy." He went on to explain, with the careful precision of his calling, that a man named Arthur Bell, formerly in the family's employment as a cataloguer of old documents, had some days previously been arrested upon a charge touching the misuse of confidential papers. This intelligence alone, he assured us, would scarcely have troubled Sir Reginald, who had dismissed Bell some years before, under a cloud of suspicion regarding certain private correspondence. But yesterday, Mr. Holmes, a bail bond was produced before the magistrate, securing Bell's release and bearing my uncle's signature. Julian Harcourt's voice dropped, as though the very walls of our sitting-room might carry the scandal further. "My uncle swears upon his honour that he never signed such a paper, nor had any knowledge of it until it was shown to him." Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed, now opened with that sudden keen brightness I knew so well. "A forgery, then? And yet you hesitate, Mr. Harcourt, as though the matter were more complicated than a common fraud." "It is, sir. The signature, I am told, is exact in every particular. Even my uncle, upon first glance, could not deny it as his own." The young man twisted his hat between his hands. "If the bond is indeed false, then someone with the most intimate access to my uncle's household must be responsible. and that, Mr. Holmes, is a thought none of us can bear to entertain." He described then the members of that household with the careful reluctance of a man forced to catalogue his own family as a list of suspects. Lady Eleanor, his uncle's widowed sister-in-law, whose whole ambition centred upon a secure future for her daughter. Miss Clara Harcourt, that daughter, whose engagement depended upon the family's spotless name. Major Stephen Vale, a cousin whose gambling debts were common knowledge and common embarrassment. Mr. Edwin Marsh, Sir Reginald's private secretary, a quiet and diligent man some years in service. Mrs. Beatrice Vale, Sir Reginald's own sister, who nursed some old grievance regarding a promise made to her late husband, and Mr. Thomas Gresham, the family solicitor, whose professional standing was bound up inextricably with the Harcourt name. "Any one of them," said Julian miserably, "might conceivably have found occasion to reach my uncle's private stationery. That is what troubles him most, Mr. Holmes. Not the forgery itself, but the certainty that it was done by a hand he trusts." Holmes rose at last and crossed to the window, where he stood looking down into the fog-shrouded street below, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have told me a great deal, Mr. Harcourt, and yet you have not told me the one thing I most wished to know. Why should anyone trouble to forge a bail bond at very considerable personal risk, merely to secure the release of a dismissed clerk accused of a comparatively minor offence? I do not know, Mr. Holmes. I only know that my uncle is beside himself, and that Ashcombe Hall has not known a night's peace since the thing was discovered." Holmes turned from the window, and I saw upon his face that particular expression, half hunger and half satisfaction, which told me the case had already taken hold of him. "Then let us go down into Surrey, Watson, and examine this too perfect signature for ourselves. I have a suspicion, Mr. Harcourt, that your uncle's trouble runs a good deal deeper than a matter of forged paper, and that we shall not get to the bottom of it without disturbing a great many family ghosts along the way. You will come then?" Julian Harcourt rose eagerly. "By the morning train," said Holmes, "and Mr. Harcourt, tell your uncle to disturb nothing upon his desk, not so much as a sheet of blotting paper. I have found, in my experience, that the smallest and most neglected objects in a room are frequently the most eloquent witnesses of all." It was thus, upon that wet November night, that we became engaged in the singular affair which I have set down here as the case of the falsified bail bond, a case which was to lead us, before its conclusion, into the darkest and most closely guarded corners of an old family's history. Chapter 2. A signature too perfect. Ashcombe Hall stood at the end of a long avenue of elms, its grey stone front softened by the persistent Surrey drizzle into something almost mournful, as though the house itself had taken on the anxieties of its master. We were received at the door by a manservant of the old school, silent and correct, who conducted us through a hall hung with the portraits of dead Harcourts into a library where the present head of that name awaited us. Sir Reginald Harcourt was a tall man, spare of frame, with the kind of iron-grey dignity that comes only to those who have spent a lifetime believing themselves the guardians of something greater than their own comfort. He rose to greet us with a courtesy so precise, so carefully measured, that I sensed at once the effort it cost him to maintain it. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you will forgive me if I seem less than hospitable. I have not slept." "I should be surprised if you had, Sir Reginald," said Holmes, seating himself unbidden and regarding our host with that quiet, searching attention which so many of his clients found unsettling upon first acquaintance. "A man does not sleep easily when his own hand has apparently been made to testify against him." "Made to testify is well put." Sir Reginald's mouth tightened. "I have spent 30 years building a reputation for probity, Mr. Holmes. I do not exaggerate when I say that my word has settled disputes among this family that might otherwise have ended in the courts, or worse, in the newspapers. And now I am told that my own signature appears upon a document I never saw, guaranteeing the liberty of a man I dismissed from this house in disgrace." He produced the bond itself, and Holmes bent over it with the close, unhurried scrutiny of a man examining a rare specimen. I confess that to my own eye the signature appeared entirely unremarkable. A bold, confident hand, the letters formed with the easy carelessness of long habit. "The paper," Holmes murmured, holding the sheet toward the window light, "comes from your own stock, does it not? I observe the watermark." "It does. From my study. The stationery is kept in a locked drawer, to which only I possess a key. And the seal? My own. Impressed, so far as I can judge, with my own seal ring, which I wear upon this hand and remove for no man." Sir Reginald extended his fingers, upon which a heavy signet caught the grey light from the window. Holmes set the paper down and regarded our host with a curious intensity. "Then you perceive the difficulty, Sir Reginald, though perhaps you have not stated it to yourself in quite these terms. Here is a signature that is not merely similar to your own, but identical in every stroke and flourish. Here is a seal that could have come from no ring but yours. Here is paper that could have come from no drawer but your own, locked though it was, and yet you insist, with every appearance of sincerity, that you did not sign it. I insist upon it because it is true." "I do not doubt you for a moment," said Holmes, to my considerable surprise, for I had rather expected him to press the old man further. "Indeed, it is precisely the perfection of the thing that persuades me of your innocence and troubles me a good deal more than any clumsy forgery could have done. But tell me, is there nothing in the document itself that strikes a false note?" Sir Reginald hesitated, then drew breath as a man does when about to confess something he finds faintly absurd. "The date, Mr. Holmes. The bond is dated Tuesday last at 9:15 in the evening. But upon that evening I dined with the county magistrates at Guildford, a full 20 miles from this house, and did not return until well past midnight. A dozen men can vouch for my presence there." "Now that," said Holmes softly, "is interesting indeed." He rose and began to move about the library with the restless quartering step I had seen him employ 100 times before, pausing here to examine a bookshelf, there to glance at the fireplace, as though the very furniture of the room might yield some fragment of intelligence. Sir Reginald watched him with an expression I could not quite read, part hope, part apprehension, as though he feared what Holmes's questions might eventually uncover, even as he longed for the mystery to be resolved. It was over the course of that long grey afternoon that we were introduced by degrees to the household. Major Stephen Vale came first, a heavy, florid man whose bluff good humour did not entirely conceal a certain hunted look about the eyes. I learned before the day was out that he had that very week applied to Sir Reginald for a loan and been refused. Lady Eleanor Harcourt followed, a handsome woman of perhaps 45, whose conversation returned again and again, with a persistence that seemed almost involuntary, to the subject of her daughter Clara's approaching marriage and the settlement that marriage required. Julian, our client of the previous evening, seemed chiefly anxious that his uncle's ordeal should not further delay his own suit for a young woman of whom, I gathered, the family did not wholly approve. Mr. Edwin Marsh, the secretary, was a quiet, watchful man who answered every question with a precision that seemed almost rehearsed, and who possessed, as Sir Reginald himself admitted, keys to nearly every room in the house. It was not until evening, when we had retired to the chamber set aside for our use, that Holmes at last spoke his mind upon the matter. "You observed the blotting paper upon Sir Reginald's desk, Watson?" "I confess I did not think it worth particular notice." "It has been replaced within the last few days. The old sheet is gone." Holmes stood at the window, his pipe unlit in his hand, staring out at the dark shapes of the elms against a clouded sky. Now, why should a man trouble himself to remove a sheet of blotting paper, unless that paper carried an impression he did not wish read? You think the forger used it to study the signature? I think, Watson, that the forger had no need to study anything. Holmes turned from the window, and there was in his face that particular sharpness which I had learned to associate with the earliest stirrings of a solution not yet fully formed. Consider the matter honestly. A forged signature, however skilfully executed, betrays itself sooner or later, under close examination. A hesitation here, an unnatural pressure there, the telltale signs of an unfamiliar hand attempting to master another man's habits. But this signature is not merely skillful, it is perfect in every particular, down to the smallest idiosyncrasy of Sir Reginald's pen. That is not the mark of a clever forger, my friend. It is the mark of something else entirely, something that troubles me a great deal more than simple fraud. What then? Holmes did not answer at once. He merely knocked out his pipe against the window ledge and said, with a quietness that somehow carried more weight than any dramatic pronouncement could have done, "The forged signature is not remarkable, Watson, because it is inaccurate. It is remarkable because it is too accurate. And when a man begins to ask himself why a false thing should be more perfect than the truth generally allows, he has taken the first step toward an answer he may not altogether welcome." With that he would say no more, and I confess I passed an uneasy night, listening to the rain upon the old windows of Ashcombe Hall, and wondering what darker business lay concealed behind its handsome and hospitable front. Chapter 3. The Locked Study. I was woken shortly after 7 the following morning by a commotion in the corridor outside our room, hurried footsteps, a woman's voice raised in something between a question and a cry, and the heavy tread of a man descending the stairs 2 at a time. Holmes was already at the door before I had fairly gathered my senses, and I followed him down into a hall filled with the pale, uncertain light of a wet Surrey dawn, and with a confusion of servants and family members such as I had rarely seen outside the wards of a hospital after some sudden catastrophe. "It is my uncle," said Julian Harcourt, white to the lips, as he met us at the foot of the stairs. "He is in his study. The door was locked from within, and we have had to force it. Doctor, Watson, for God's sake, come at once." I needed no second bidding. We found Sir Reginald Harcourt lying upon the floor of his study, close by the desk at which we had examined the fatal bond the previous afternoon, his face a leaden grey, and his breathing shallow and irregular. I knelt beside him at once and made such examination as the circumstances permitted, while Holmes stood in the doorway, his eyes moving swiftly about the room, even as he inquired, in a voice remarkably steady given the alarm about him, after the particulars of the discovery. "He is alive," I said, after a moment that seemed to stretch intolerably long, "but he has suffered some severe shock to the system. I can find no wound, no sign of violence upon his person. It has the appearance of a seizure, though whether of natural origin or induced by some great mental strain I cannot yet say." "He must be got to his bed," said Holmes, "and Watson must attend him. But first, Watson, look carefully as you go. I would have your eyes as well as mine upon this room before it is disturbed further." It required the assistance of 2 footmen to carry Sir Reginald to his chamber, and it was the better part of an hour before I could pronounce him out of immediate danger, though he remained insensible to questioning, his eyes open but unseeing, his lips forming words that carried no meaning I could discern. It was a grievous business, and I own that my sympathies were entirely with the stricken old man, whatever secrets his household might yet conceal. When at last I rejoined Holmes in the study, I found him upon his knees before the hearth, examining with his lens a stub of candle that had burned down to an inch or less within its silver holder. "A candle, Watson, tells a great deal to one who troubles to read it properly," said he, without looking up. "This one has burned a good deal lower than the household's habits would suggest was necessary. Sir Reginald, I am given to understand, retires early and reads little by candlelight, preferring the lamp upon his desk. Yet here is a candle that has burned for the better part of 2 hours, beyond what any ordinary evening in this room would require. You think someone sat here with him? Or after him? I think at the least that someone required light in this room for a considerable time, and did not wish to disturb the lamp, which stands nearer the window and might have been observed from the drive." Holmes rose and crossed to the desk, where a drawer stood some inches open, its contents of old letters and legal papers visibly disturbed. "And here is something more curious still. Sir Reginald informs me, for he was able, before his collapse fully overtook him, to gasp out a single sentence to his nephew, that a sealed packet marked Harcourt Settlement, 1898, is missing from this drawer. Stolen, then? Or removed, which is not quite the same thing, though the household is naturally inclined to assume the worse construction. Holmes examined the drawer's lock with close attention. No force has been used here, Watson. Whoever opened this drawer either possessed a key or found it already unlocked. We were interrupted at this point by the household descending upon us in the wake of the alarm, each member offering some fragment of anxiety that struck me, even in the confusion of the moment, as curiously revealing of the mind behind it. Lady Eleanor came first, her composure visibly shaken, demanding to know at once whether the missing papers touched upon questions of inheritance, a query she repeated twice, as though the answer mattered to her more than her brother-in-law's health. Major Vale, close behind her, asked with rather less delicacy whether Sir Reginald had lately altered his will, a question that drew a sharp glance from Julian, who himself seemed less concerned with the missing settlement than with whether his uncle had spoken to anyone or written anything before his collapse. Marsh, entering last and most quietly of all, inquired in a low voice whether Arthur Bell had yet been communicated with regarding the morning's events, a question that struck me as singularly out of place, given that Bell, so far as any of us knew, had no possible connection with what had occurred in a locked room 20 miles from his lodgings. Holmes said little during this exchange, but I observed that he watched each speaker with the close, unhurried attention of a naturalist studying some new and interesting species. It was not until the household had dispersed, and we were once more alone in the study, that he gave voice to his thoughts. You will have noticed, Watson, that grief, when genuine, is a clumsy thing. It stumbles over itself. It repeats what has already been said, and asks questions to which it already half knows the answer, simply for the comfort of hearing them answered again. Surprise, upon the other hand, is a far more difficult thing to counterfeit convincingly, for it requires a man to react to intelligence he has not yet had time to prepare himself against. You think one of them was not surprised? I think, said Holmes, moving to the window and gazing out over the wet lawns toward the distant line of the drive, that when Julian first spoke the words Harcourt Settlement, 1898, in this room, not 20 minutes past, every face in that gathering registered some measure of shock or alarm. Every face, Watson, save one. And that face, I may tell you, belonged to a person who had every reason, upon the ordinary construction of events, to be as astonished as the rest. Who, Holmes? But he would not yet be drawn further, save to add with a gravity I had seldom heard him employ, We are dealing, my dear fellow, not with a simple theft, nor even with a simple forgery, but with some deeper and more carefully guarded matter, of which the bail bond and this morning's calamity are but the visible surface. Somewhere beneath the placid waters of this respectable old family lies a stone that someone has laboured very hard indeed to keep from view. I mean to find it, whatever the cost to the Harcourt name. And with that he fell silent, and began once more his slow, deliberate circuit of the room, missing nothing, though he confided nothing further to me that morning. Chapter 4. 11 minutes missing. By the middle of that afternoon Sir Reginald had recovered sufficiently to take a little broth, and to answer, in halting fashion, some few questions from Inspector Lestrade, who had been summoned from London upon the strength of the forged bond and now found himself confronted with a considerably graver matter. I remained near the old man's bedside for the better part of the day, more from professional caution than any belief that his condition required constant attendance, while Holmes occupied himself below stairs with an inquiry into the movements of the household upon the preceding evening. It was not until dinner that he laid before me, in that methodical fashion he reserved for the ordering of his difficult problem, the results of his labours. I have had the whole establishment through my hands to-day, Watson, from the housekeeper to the boot boy, and I flatter myself I have now a tolerably accurate picture of the evening's events. He drew out his notebook and consulted it, though I suspect the exercise was as much for my benefit as his own. his memory being in such matters entirely reliable. Dinner concluded at 20 minutes to 9. Sir Reginald withdrew shortly afterward to his study, as was his invariable custom, to attend to correspondence before retiring. Coffee was carried into the drawing-room at 10 minutes past 9, and the household, Lady Eleanor, Major Vale, Julian and Miss Clara, remained there in conversation. At 9:30, a housemaid carried certain letters up to the first floor for the morning post, and at 9:45 Marsh, going to the study to inquire whether Sir Reginald required anything further, found the door locked and receiving no answer to his knock, raised the alarm that led to its being forced. That accounts for the whole evening then, does it not? It accounts, my dear Watson, for every minute save 11. Holmes tapped the notebook with a thin forefinger. The housemaid who carried the letters upstairs at 9:30 did not return to the servants' hall until 19 minutes to 10. Her own account is that she paused to speak with the second footman upon the landing, a circumstance he confirms, though neither can say with any precision how long the conversation lasted. It is a small thing, but small things have a way of multiplying in a case of this character, and when I set the housemaid's uncertain 9 minutes beside 2 minutes, wholly unaccounted for in the movements of another member of this household, I arrive at a gap of very nearly 1/4 of an hour in which the study door was neither watched nor guarded. I confess the arithmetic seemed to me a slender foundation upon which to build any theory of consequence, and I said as much. Slender it may be, but it is not unsupported. Holmes rose and began, as was his habit when a problem pressed closely upon him, to pace the length of the room. Consider the hall clock, Watson. I examined it this morning, and I am prepared to swear that it had been deliberately stopped and set going again within the last 2 days. The mechanism shows every sign of recent interference, though a casual glance would detect nothing amiss. But to what purpose? A clock stopped for a few minutes could hardly account for 11 unless it was stopped precisely to obscure the true length of some interval, that its owner wished to appear shorter than it was. You see the beauty of it, Watson. A clock that runs a little slow and is then corrected leaves no record of the correction save to the man who troubles to compare its workings against another timepiece in the house. I did so this afternoon, using my own watch and the clock in the servants' hall as my standards, and I find the discrepancy amounts to very nearly 11 minutes. I own that a chill passed over me at this, for it seemed to bring the shadow of some deliberate and calculating hand very close indeed to the stricken old man upstairs. There is more, Holmes continued. You will recall the door leading from the study corridor into the conservatory, the one kept bolted by Sir Reginald's own account throughout the colder months. I examined its lower hinge this morning, and found the dust disturbed in a manner wholly inconsistent with a door that has remained shut since October. It has been opened, Watson, and opened recently, though the bolt itself has since been carefully replaced. Then someone entered the study by that route, avoiding the corridor altogether, and so avoiding observation. It is at least a possibility we cannot afford to disregard, and I have one further fact for your consideration, which I confess puzzles me more than all the rest together. He paused in his pacing and turned to face me directly. The missing settlement packet, according to Sir Reginald's own description, given before his collapse fully overtook him, was sealed with a dark green wax bearing the impression of his signet. I have examined the wax kept in his study for that purpose, in a small box upon the desk. It is not green, Watson, but a deep crimson, such as has been used in this household for a generation. You mean the packet was resealed, somewhere else with different materials, before it vanished? I mean that whoever removed the true settlement from that drawer either substituted for it a false packet, prepared in advance, or resealed the original elsewhere with wax that did not match what Sir Reginald himself would have used. Either conclusion tells us the same essential fact. This was no hasty theft, snatched up in a moment of opportunity. It was planned, Watson, and planned with a foresight that argues considerable intelligence and considerable time in the preparation. Our conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Lestrade himself, brisk and self-satisfied in a manner I had come to recognise as presaging some discovery he considered conclusive. "I think we may have got to the bottom of this a good deal faster than you suppose, Mr. Holmes," said he, settling into a chair without invitation. "I have been asking about the house regarding Major Vale, and I find his debts are a good deal more pressing than the family cares to admit. A creditor called upon him privately not 2 days before the bond appeared, and a housemaid, not the same one who carried the letters, mind you, but another, reports having seen him near the study corridor upon the very evening in question, at an hour she cannot precisely fix, but which she believes to have been somewhat before 10. "Does she indeed?" said Holmes, with an inflection I could not quite read. "It seems plain enough to me. A man in debt, a family secret worth money to the right buyer, and a former employee freed from custody just when he might be persuaded to talk. I should say Major Vale had a very direct interest in seeing Arthur Bell at liberty." Holmes regarded the inspector for a long moment before replying, and when he spoke it was with a quiet deliberation that I had learned, over many years, to associate with a conclusion very different from the one being pressed upon him. "If Major Vale desired money, Lestrade, he has behaved with singular industry in drawing attention to the fact. A guilty man engaged in so delicate and dangerous a scheme does not commonly advertise his financial distress to every housemaid in the establishment, nor place himself by his own carelessness in the one corridor where he was certain to be observed. I do not say the Major is innocent of every fault. His debts, I have no doubt, are real enough. But I would ask you to consider, before you close your notebook upon this matter, whether a man clever enough to forge a signature so perfect that its own owner could not at first deny it, would be careless enough to be seen loitering outside a locked door by the very housemaid he must have known would be questioned." Lestrade's confidence wavered visibly, though he was not a man to abandon a promising theory without a struggle. "Then who, in your opinion, Mr. Holmes?" "In my opinion, Inspector, we have not yet asked the right questions of the right people. Tomorrow I intend to remedy that omission." And with this Holmes would say no more, though I observed that he sat late into the night beside the study window, watching, as I supposed, the dark shape of the conservatory beyond, and turning over in his mind some train of thought he had not yet seen fit to share even with me. Chapter 5. What Was Never Said. Holmes announced his intention, over an early breakfast, of interviewing each member of the household in turn, alone, and without the comforting presence of the others to shape or soften what might otherwise be said. A family gathered together, Watson, presents a united front by instinct, as a herd of deer will close ranks against a wolf, separate them, and each animal begins to think first of its own safety. It was not, I confess, a flattering comparison to draw upon our hosts, but I had long since learned that Holmes's metaphors, however unkind, were seldom inaccurate. He began with Major Vale, whom he received in the small morning room overlooking the drive, and I was permitted to remain as silent witness to the exchange. "You will not, I think, deny your debts, Major," said Holmes without preamble, "since half the household appears already to know of them." Vale's florid countenance darkened, though he answered readily enough. "I'll deny nothing, Mr. Holmes. I owe money, and a good deal of it, and I'll own I asked my cousin for assistance not a fortnight since. But I'll tell you what that policeman of yours has not troubled to ask. Reginald had already half promised me the money, before ever this business of the bond came to light. He said as much to me privately not 3 days before. I've no cause to forge his signature when the man himself was on the point of putting his hand willingly to a cheque. Can you produce any witness to that promise? None but Reginald himself, and he lies upstairs unable to say 2 words together." Vale's voice took on a note of bitter frustration. "It's a damned awkward position, Mr. Holmes, and I don't mind telling you I feel the noose tightening whether I've done anything to deserve it or not." Holmes made no comment upon this, save to thank the Major for his candour, and passed next to Lady Eleanor, who received us in her own sitting-room with a composure that seemed to me rather more deliberate than natural. She spoke, when pressed, of her fears concerning Clara's dowry, fears which she did not trouble to disguise. "Sir Reginald has spoken more than once of reducing the settlement he intended for my daughter," said she, her hands folded rather too precisely in her lap. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that Clara's happiness depends upon a marriage that her fiancé's family will only sanction if the financial arrangements are entirely secure. I will confess I argued with my brother-in-law upon the subject not long before this trouble began. I am not ashamed of it. A mother must look to her daughter's interests." It was, I thought, an admission delivered with unusual readiness, almost as though it were offered to forestall some other, less convenient question. Holmes seemed to entertain a similar suspicion, for he pressed her rather further upon the precise nature of her disagreement with Sir Reginald, but she would say only that the matter concerned money, and money alone, and grew visibly impatient under his continued questioning until he judged it prudent to withdraw. Our next interview was with Miss Clara Harcourt herself, and it was here, I think, that the case first began to shift beneath our feet in a manner I had not anticipated. She was a slight, fair girl of perhaps 20, with a gravity in her expression that seemed older than her years, and she answered Holmes's opening question, whether she shared her mother's anxiety regarding the marriage settlement, with a small, decided shake of the head. "My engagement was never in danger over money, Mr. Holmes, whatever my mother believes, or wishes to believe." She glanced toward the door as though to satisfy herself it was closed, before continuing in a lower voice. "Henry's family have never once raised the question of my dowry. Their fear, if I may call it that, concerns something else entirely, something touching my late father's memory, though I have never been able to learn precisely what. Your father died when you were young. When I was 11, Mr. Holmes. I remember very little of him, save that he was much away from home in his later years, and that my Uncle Reginald has always spoken of him with a peculiar carefulness, as though choosing each word with great deliberation. She twisted a fold of her gown between her fingers. I have sometimes thought there was some old trouble in the family that no one has ever seen fit to explain to me, though I cannot say what it might be, nor why it should concern my engagement now, so many years after his death." Holmes regarded her for a long moment with an expression of unusual gentleness. "I thank you, Miss Harcourt. You have given me, I think, the most valuable intelligence I have yet received in this house." We saw Julian next, who confirmed, with evident reluctance, that Arthur Bell had once hinted to him, before his dismissal, that the Harcourt family possessed documents capable, in his phrase, of bringing down more than one respectable name in this county. Julian had thought little of the remark at the time, dismissing it as the resentful talk of a man about to lose his position, but he owned that it had returned to trouble him a good deal since the appearance of the forged bond. It was Marsh, however, the quiet and watchful secretary, who proved the most difficult subject of all. He answered every question with a precision that seemed almost rehearsed, offering nothing beyond what was strictly demanded of him, and returning again and again whenever the conversation touched upon the missing settlement or the events of that fatal evening to a single phrase, delivered always in the same low, careful tone. "Certain matters, Mr. Holmes, are better left as they stand." "That is a curious sentiment for a man in your position to hold," Holmes observed, "given that your employer lies gravely ill, very possibly as the direct consequence of those same matters remaining undisturbed." Marsh's composure flickered, just perceptibly, before he answered. "I have served this family for 11 years, sir. I have seen a great deal in that time that I have judged it wise not to speak of. I do not say this to obstruct your inquiry, but because I believe, in my own poor judgment, that some truths do more harm dragged into the light than left quietly buried." It was an answer that told us nothing directly, and yet, as Holmes remarked to me once we were alone again, it told us a very great deal indirectly. "You perceive the pattern now forming, Watson?" He stood at the window of our chamber, watching the grey afternoon light fade over the lawns. "Each of these people knows some fragment of a single secret, yet none will describe it whole. Lady Eleanor speaks of money to hide her true anxiety. Julian speaks of Bell's hints, but no more. Marsh speaks in riddles of matters better left alone. And Clara, the one person in this household with the least reason to dissemble, tells us plainly that the trouble concerns not money, but her father's memory. You think they are all protecting the same thing? I think, Watson, that there has existed among certain members of this family, for some years past, an unspoken agreement, a conspiracy of silence, if you will, entered into long before ever the bail bond was forged or the settlement stolen. Their fear, when you strip away every pretense of financial anxiety, is not poverty at all. He turned from the window, and his face, in the failing light, wore an expression of unusual gravity. It is exposure, and a family that fears exposure above all else, Watson, will go to very great lengths indeed to prevent it. Lengths that may, I greatly fear, extend to forgery, to theft, and perhaps to worse, besides. Chapter 6. Arthur Bell's Bargain. We travelled up to London upon the following morning, leaving Sir Reginald in the care of a local physician whom I had satisfied myself was competent to the task, and Lestrade in charge of such household inquiries as remained to be pursued at Ashcombe Hall. Holmes had said little upon the journey, save to observe once, as the train drew through the wet fields of Surrey, that a case which begins with a forged document commonly ends with a true one, and that our business in town was to discover which of the two we had yet properly examined. Arthur Bell had taken lodgings since his release, in a mean street off the Borough High Street, and we found him in a small back room that smelt of damp plaster and boiled cabbage, a thin, anxious man of perhaps 40, with the pinched look of one who has known better circumstances and has not yet grown accustomed to their loss. "I've told the police everything I know, Mr. Holmes, and precious little good it's done me," said he, when Holmes had explained the purpose of our visit. "I never forged that bond, sir, and I never asked a living soul to arrange it. It came to my solicitor by the morning post without so much as a note attached, and I was as astonished as any man in England to find myself at liberty." "You had made no arrangement, then, with anyone connected to the Harcourt family?" "None, Mr. Holmes. I'll not deny I once hoped Sir Reginald might see his way to a character reference, when first I was taken up, but he'd have sooner seen me hanged, I think, than lift a finger on my behalf." Bell's mouth twisted with something between bitterness and old grief. "There's history between myself and that family that I'd as soon not go into, sir, if it's all the same to you." "I think you'd better go into it none the less," said Holmes, seating himself upon the room's single unbroken chair, "since it is precisely that history, I begin to suspect, which has occasioned all our present trouble." Bell was silent for a long moment, turning something over in his mind before he spoke again. His voice dropped almost to a whisper, as though the thin walls of his lodging might carry his words to unfriendly ears. "I worked among the family papers at Ashcombe Hall for the better part of 6 years, Mr. Holmes, cataloguing old deeds and settlements and the like, going back 3 generations and more. It was dull work, but honest, until I came upon certain documents that troubled me a good deal, papers touching upon a marriage record some 40 years old, and a defect in it that seemed to me, though I am no lawyer, to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of one whole branch of the family's claim to the Harcourt name. I felt Holmes grow very still beside me, though his face betrayed nothing beyond a keen and steady attention. "I said nothing of it at the time," Bell continued, "believing it none of my affair, and I might have carried the knowledge to my grave but for the manner of my dismissal. Sir Reginald turned me off on a charge of copying private correspondence, which I'll own I did, Mr. Holmes, though not for the reasons he supposed. I copied certain papers because I feared they might otherwise vanish altogether, and I judged that a man in my position, without friends or influence, had best keep some proof of what he'd seen against the day he might need it." "A prudent if dangerous precaution," Holmes observed. "And did you ever make use of this proof?" "Never, sir, not in the way you mean. I've no wish to ruin any man, whatever wrong he may have done me." Bell's hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he spoke. "But some little while before my arrest I was approached, privately and with great caution, by a person who offered me a considerable sum of money for whatever I might know or possess touching the old settlement papers." "You refused?" "I did, Mr. Holmes, and I'll tell you honestly it went hard against my own interest to do so, situated as I am. But there was something in the manner of the offer that frightened me a good deal more than poverty ever has. I began to feel, sir, that I had stumbled into deeper water than I understood, and that the safest course for a man like myself was to know nothing, and to say nothing, and to hope the whole business would pass me by." Holmes leaned forward. "This person who approached you, can you describe them?" Bell hesitated, glancing toward the door as though he feared even now to be overheard. "I'd rather not put a name to it, Mr. Holmes, having no proof beyond my own impression, and no wish to bring further trouble upon myself. I do not ask for a name. I ask only whether it was a man or a woman who came to you." There was a long pause, and then Bell said, very low, "A woman, sir. I'll say no more than that." Holmes didn't press him further, and indeed I thought I detected in his manner something very like satisfaction, as though this single fragment of intelligence had confirmed a suspicion already half formed in his mind. We took our leave shortly afterward, Bell's anxious, hollow-eyed face lingering in my thoughts as the train carried us back towards Surrey through the gathering dusk. It was not until we had returned to Ashcombe Hall, and Holmes had spent a further hour closeted with the household stationery under his lens, that he shared with me the fruit of that examination. I have compared the paper of the forged bond with the fragments of wax and wrapping recovered from the study, Watson, and I find them to be of the same uncommon batch, a paper manufactured, so far as I can discover from the stationer's mark, in a limited quantity some 3 years since, and supplied exclusively to this household. He set down his lens with the air of a man laying a final card upon the table. I have made inquiry discreetly as to who among this establishment has regular occasion to handle that particular stock. The answer narrows our field considerably. Sir Reginald himself, of course, Marsh, in the ordinary course of his secretarial duties, and Lady Eleanor, who is accustomed to using the study desk for her own correspondence when her brother-in-law is from home. Then it is one of the three. So the paper alone would suggest, and yet I find myself unwilling to draw so simple a conclusion, for I have observed a discrepancy that puzzles me a good deal more than the question of who might have had access to a locked drawer. Holmes drew out his notebook and consulted it with evident care. Lady Eleanor, in conversation with Lestrade this afternoon, spoke of the bond as having been signed upon Tuesday evening, which is, of course, the date the document itself bears. Marsh, upon the other hand, in a remark that I do not think he intended me to overhear, spoke of it as though the actual work of preparation had taken place upon Wednesday. A slip of the tongue, perhaps. Perhaps. Or perhaps, Watson, a genuine confusion between the date a document is dated to appear and the date upon which it is truly created. A confusion that only a person closely involved in its preparation would be likely to commit. The bond itself insists upon Tuesday, but someone in this house, I am now very nearly persuaded, knows precisely when that document was actually written, and it was not upon the evening it claims. Chapter 7. The Account at Charing Cross. Lestrade arrived at Ashcombe Hall the following morning in a state of considerable excitement, an emotion so foreign to his customary manner of stolid, unimaginative competence that I confess it prepared me for some discovery of real consequence before he had spoken a single word. "I think we have him this time, Mr. Holmes," said he, laying his hat upon the library table with something approaching triumph. "I have been to Charing Cross, and to 2 or 3 other quarters besides, and I believe I can now put the whole matter before a jury without the smallest difficulty." Holmes, who had been engaged in a close examination of the county directory, set the volume aside and regarded the inspector with an attention that betrayed no particular anxiety, though I own my own pulse quickened at the news. "A bank clerk at Major Vale's establishment," Lestrade continued, consulting his notebook with evident satisfaction, "confirms that the Major withdrew a very considerable sum in ready money not 4 days before the bail bond made its appearance. I have traced a portion of that money, not all of it, mind you, but a portion sufficient to satisfy any reasonable jury, to a man in Clerkenwell who is well known to my colleagues in the City Police as a document specialist of remarkable and I may say disreputable skill. Forged signatures, imitated seals, the reproduction of old documents for purposes better left unexamined. It is his particular trade, Mr. Holmes, and he has admitted, under a certain amount of pressure, to receiving payment in connection with a Harcourt document." "Indeed," said Holmes, "and has this admirable craftsman identified his client?" "He claims he cannot, having dealt as such men generally do through an intermediary and under conditions of considerable secrecy. But I need no further identification, Mr. Holmes, for I have this morning searched Major Vale's room, with his own reluctant consent, and found among his papers a sheet upon which Sir Reginald's signature has been practised, not once but a dozen times, each attempt drawing nearer to perfection than the last. I confess this last piece of intelligence struck me as very nearly conclusive, and I said as much to Holmes, who received my observation with a faint, unreadable smile. "The case upon its face is undeniably strong," said he. "Let us hear what the Major himself has to say before we pronounce final judgment upon it." Major Vale was accordingly summoned, and I have seldom seen a man labour under such visible and painful embarrassment. He did not deny the practice sheet found among his papers, nor the visit to the document specialist in Clerkenwell, but the explanation he offered, delivered in halting and disjointed phrases, was one that Lestrade received with open scepticism. I'll own I went to the fellow, Mr. Holmes, and I'll own I paid him money, though not near so much as the inspector supposes. But it was no forgery of Reginald's bail bond I wanted from him. There is an old dispute, sir, touching a military certificate of my late father's, upon which a private debt of some standing depends, and the original document has been lost these many years. I wanted nothing more than a faithful copy, that I might settle the matter without further scandal to the family. "And the practice of Sir Reginald's signature?" Lestrade demanded, with the air of a man producing an unanswerable objection. Vale's colour deepened. "I'll not deny I attempted it, though I'm ashamed to own why. Reginald had promised me assistance, as I told Mr. Holmes before, and I thought, God forgive me for a fool, that I might spare him the trouble of a personal application by preparing a note of guarantee myself, for his signature only, against the day he should choose to make the promise good. It was a foolish scheme, and I abandoned it, and I never for one moment intended it to touch upon Bell's bail, of which I knew nothing whatever until the whole household was thrown into confusion by its appearance." Lestrade's expression made it plain that he considered this explanation a transparent fabrication, hastily constructed to fit facts that could no longer be denied, and I confess that even my own sympathies, disposed as they generally were toward the accused in such situations, found the Major's account a difficult one to credit in its entirety. The financial motive, laid end to end with Bell's dangerous knowledge and the undeniable evidence of the practised signature, seemed to close about him with a completeness that admitted little room for doubt. "You perceive, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, when Vale had been permitted to withdraw, his face a study in wretched apprehension, "how neatly the whole affair now arranges itself. The Major required money. Bell possessed knowledge that might, in the right hands, be turned to profit. The forged bond secured Bell's liberty, that he might be approached and persuaded to sell what he knew. And the missing settlement, once recovered, would furnish further material for the same dark purpose. I own that even I, sitting beside Holmes through this recital, found myself very nearly persuaded, and I said in a low voice, that the case did indeed seem to close about Major Vale with remarkable completeness. "It does," said Holmes, "and it is precisely that completeness, Watson, which gives me pause." He rose and walked slowly to the window, his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude I had come to associate with his deepest reflection. You will recall a maxim I have had occasion to state before, that when a chain of evidence fits together with too perfect a symmetry, one does well to examine the joints a little more closely before trusting one's whole weight upon it. You do not believe him guilty. I believe, Watson, that Major Vale has behaved throughout this business like a man whose principal talent lies in attracting suspicion to himself through simple carelessness, rather than a man capable of executing a scheme requiring the delicate and patient preparation this forgery undoubtedly demanded. Consider his reaction, even now, to the ruin that threatens him. I recalled, upon reflection, that the Major's demeanour throughout the interview had been one of genuine and unguarded distress. Anger at his own folly, certainly, and something very like despair at the position in which he found himself, but nothing of the cold, calculating self-possession I should have expected in a man who had planned and executed so intricate a fraud. "He is angry, Watson, and he is frightened, in the manner of a man who sees himself unjustly accused and knows not how to prove his innocence. That is a very different thing from the demeanour of guilt discovered." Holmes turned from the window, and his gaze travelled, I thought, toward the door through which the household had earlier passed in the course of the day's alarms. "But there was another face in this house today, Watson, when the evidence against Major Vale was first laid open before the assembled family. A face that did not share in his distress, nor in his despair, but wore instead an expression I can describe only as relief. It was fleeting and swiftly mastered, but I did not mistake it, and I do not think upon reflection that you did either. I confess I had observed nothing of the kind, so absorbed had I been in the unfolding drama of Vale's interrogation, and I said so with some embarrassment. "No matter," said Holmes, though not unkindly. "You have other virtues, my dear fellow, which I value a good deal more than a talent for reading faces. But I will tell you this much. The true architect of this scheme has watched Major Vale drawn steadily into a net not of his own weaving, and has felt at every fresh turn of the evidence against him a mounting and unmistakable relief. That relief, Watson, is the one piece of testimony in this whole affair that cannot be forged, however perfect a hand the guilty party may command with pen and paper. And I mean, before very much longer, to discover precisely whose face it was that wore it." Chapter 8. The Wrong Kind of Fear. To my very considerable surprise, Holmes made no immediate effort to contradict the case that Lestrade had built against Major Vale, but rather appeared content over the course of that afternoon and evening to allow the household to believe the matter all but settled. When I remarked upon this, as we sat together after dinner in the small sitting-room set aside for our use, he answered with the particular quietness of a man who has already determined his course, and sees no profit in explaining it before the proper moment. "There are times, Watson, when the surest method of discovering a truth is to permit a falsehood to circulate freely, and to observe who among those who hear it feels their burden lightened rather than increased. I have said as much to you before in other cases, and I shall say it again now. A false accusation, skilfully allowed to take root, is sometimes a more delicate instrument of detection than the sharpest examination." I did not fully comprehend his meaning until we descended to dinner, where the household had gathered in a state of subdued and uneasy formality, Sir Reginald's chair standing empty at the head of the table, for he remained yet confined to his room, though I was glad to report his condition steadily improving. It was over the fish course that I began to observe, as Holmes had evidently anticipated, a curious alteration in the temper of those about us. Lady Eleanor, who had appeared drawn and anxious throughout the preceding days, seemed now to have recovered something of her former composure. She spoke with almost her old assurance upon trivial matters, the weather, the prospects for the following week's hunting, a letter she had lately received from a cousin in Bath, and I noticed that her hand, when she raised her wine-glass, no longer trembled as it had done at breakfast. Clara, upon the other hand, sat pale and largely silent, toying with her food rather than eating it, and when Julian attempted some clumsy pleasantry regarding the case being nearly closed, she turned upon him a look of such genuine distress that he coloured, and fell silent, plainly at a loss to account for her reaction. Marsh, who had taken his meals of late with the family in consequence of Sir Reginald's incapacity, grew visibly more agitated as the meal progressed, scarcely touching the dishes set before him, and twice I observed him glance toward the door as though he expected or feared some interruption. It was Julian himself, however, who furnished Holmes with the intelligence he had evidently been awaiting. As the ladies withdrew and the gentlemen remained over their port, the young barrister drew his chair a little nearer to Holmes's and spoke in a low, confidential tone that he plainly believed was pitched beneath my hearing, though I caught it well enough. I wonder, Mr. Holmes, whether Major Vale's guilt, once established to Inspector Lestrade's satisfaction, might be thought sufficient to close the whole inquiry. I ask only because my uncle's health is a matter of the first importance to me, and I confess I dread the thought of the old settlement business being dragged further into the light, when it can serve no purpose now but to distress him further, and perhaps to distress others besides. Holmes regarded him for a moment with an expression of polite interest that gave no hint of the significance he plainly attached to the question. "You believe, then, that the missing settlement has no true bearing upon the forgery, and might safely be set aside once the Major's part in the affair is proven?" "I believe," said Julian, with a carefulness that struck me, even at the time, as somewhat overdone, "that a family has a right to its own history, Mr. Holmes, and that not every old paper need be paraded before a court of law merely because it happens to lie near the scene of a more recent crime." It was not until we had retired for the night that Holmes gave voice to the satisfaction that question had evidently afforded him. "There it is, Watson," said he, seating himself by the fire with the air of a man who has at last laid his hand upon the final piece of a difficult puzzle. "Julian's question tells us, more plainly than any direct confession could have done, that money has never been the true centre of this case. He does not ask whether Vale is guilty. He asks whether Vale's guilt, once accepted, will be permitted to close the door upon any further inquiry into the settlement. That is not the question of a man anxious to see justice done. It is the question of a man anxious to see a particular and painful line of inquiry abandoned." "Then you believe the forged bond was never truly intended to free Bell at all, or rather, not for Bell's own sake?" "I believe, Watson, that the bond was created for a purpose a good deal more subtle than the mere liberation of a dismissed clerk. Consider the sequence of events as they must have appeared to any investigator arriving fresh to the case, as Lestrade did. A former employee, dismissed under suspicious circumstances, is arrested. A forged bond mysteriously secures his release. A large sum of money is traced to a member of the household with pressing debts, and a valuable family document vanishes almost simultaneously. Laid end to end, these facts tell a single, coherent, and thoroughly convincing story. A story of financial blackmail in which Bell's dangerous knowledge is to be purchased or extracted through his temporary liberty. And you do not believe that story. I believe it was constructed with very considerable care precisely in order to be believed. The forged bond was never chiefly a device to free Bell. It was a device to establish, in the minds of Lestrade and of any court that might eventually examine the matter, a plausible and self-contained narrative of financial motive, one sufficiently convincing to close the case before the true purpose behind it could ever come under scrutiny. I confess this seemed to me, at first hearing, a somewhat elaborate construction to place upon a single forged document, and I said so. It would be elaborate indeed, Watson, if it stood alone. But recollect what else we have learned. Someone wished us to believe the bond was signed upon Tuesday, when I now have good reason to suspect it was in fact prepared a full day earlier. Someone required this room disturbed for the better part of 2 hours upon the night of Sir Reginald's collapse, and required 11 minutes of unaccounted time in which to accomplish it. Someone required Major Vale's financial distress to be common knowledge throughout this household. That suspicion might fall naturally and inevitably upon him once the money began to be traced. None of this argues a hasty crime of opportunity. It argues a design, Watson, conceived well in advance, and executed with a patience that only a person deeply and permanently established within these walls could have commanded. Holmes rose then and moved toward the door, and I saw upon his face a resolve I had learned, over many years of our association, never to mistake for anything less than the imminent conclusion of a case. I mean to test my theory tonight, Watson, and I shall want your assistance in the doing of it. Tomorrow morning, at breakfast, I intend to announce to the assembled household that the missing settlement of 1898 has been recovered, and that it will be laid before Sir Reginald and examined in full detail before the day is out. It is, I need hardly tell you, entirely untrue. but I have a very strong conviction that the announcement will not be received with equal composure by every person at that table, and I mean to be watching very closely indeed when it is made. Chapter 9. The Name That Must Survive. Holmes did not, in the event, wait for morning. Some hour after our conversation had concluded, and I had begun to compose myself for sleep, he appeared once more at my door, fully dressed, with that particular brightness in his eye that told me some fresh resolve had seized him. "I have reconsidered, Watson. A household under suspicion sleeps lightly, and I have no wish to allow a full night's reflection to steady any nerve that stands in need of shaking. I have taken the liberty of mentioning, in the housekeeper's hearing not 10 minutes since, that the missing settlement has this evening been recovered from among Sir Reginald's effects, and that Mr. Holmes intends to examine it privately in his room before it is laid before the family at breakfast. You trust the housekeeper to carry the tale. I trust human nature, Watson, which has never yet failed me in such particulars. A piece of intelligence confided as a secret travels through a household a good deal faster than one proclaimed from the housetops." He extinguished our lamp and drew the door nearly shut, leaving only a narrow line of shadow through which the corridor might be observed. "Now we have only to wait, and to keep very still." We waited, in that close and breathless darkness, for the better part of an hour, until, a little after 1 o'clock, I heard a soft and cautious tread upon the corridor without, followed by the faint unmistakable sound of a hand testing the latch of Holmes's own door, some few paces distant from where we stood concealed. Holmes was through our door and across the passage before I had fairly gathered my wits, and I followed close upon his heels to find him with a firm grip upon the arm of a figure who struggled weakly, and then, recognizing the futility of resistance, subsided into a kind of shuddering stillness. It was Edwin Marsh, in his nightclothes, a candle guttering in his free hand, his face in the wavering light a study of such abject terror that I felt, despite everything, a stirring of pity for the man. "Mr. Holmes, I can explain. I meant no harm by it, I swear to you." "I do not think you meant harm to me, Marsh," said Holmes, releasing his hold but placing himself between the secretary and the stairs, "though I think you meant a very particular sort of harm to the truth. Come into my room, if you please, and Dr. Watson and I will hear what you have to say, before I am obliged to summon the household and let them hear it also." It was in that small chamber, by the light of a single candle, that Marsh's composure broke entirely, and the whole miserable history of the affair came pouring from him in broken, disjointed sentences, punctuated by long silences in which he seemed to struggle against some deep and long-established habit of loyalty. "I am not the one who began this, Mr. Holmes, though I'll not pretend I haven't a heavy share of the guilt. I have served this family 11 years, and I'd have gone to my grave protecting them, had it not come to this. Had Sir Reginald not been struck down, God help him, through no true fault of mine." "Then tell me who did begin it," said Holmes, not unkindly, "for I think, Marsh, that you have carried this burden a good deal longer than your strength was suited to bear, and I believe you will find it a relief to set it down at last." It was not until the following morning, however, when Sir Reginald himself, sufficiently recovered to sit propped upon his pillows, had been told the whole of what Marsh had confessed, and the household gathered once more in the drawing-room at Holmes's request, that the full and melancholy history of the Harcourt secret was laid open before us all. I will spare you, so far as I am able, the more painful particulars. Holmes began, standing before the cold hearth with the family arranged about him in attitudes of dread and expectation, and confine myself to the essential facts, which I believe Mr. Marsh's own account will confirm in every material point. Some years ago, in the course of his employment cataloguing the family archive, Arthur Bell came upon evidence of a technical defect in a marriage record some 40 years old, a defect which, under the rigid conventions of our present society, called into question the legitimacy of one branch of this family's claim to bear the Harcourt name. That branch, I need hardly say to those present, was Clara's own. A small involuntary sound escaped Lady Eleanor, though she did not speak, and Clara herself sat very white and still, her eyes fixed upon Holmes with an expression I found difficult to read. Sir Reginald, upon learning of this defect some years since, made the decision, out of what I do not doubt was genuine affection, however misguided its expression, to suppress the matter entirely, rather than permit it to touch either Lady Eleanor or her daughter. He believed, I think rightly, that Clara's happiness and Lady Eleanor's peace of mind depended upon a secret kept, and he kept it, at no small cost to his own conscience, for a great many years. "But Bell knew," said Julian in a low voice. "Bell knew, and Bell said nothing, for he is, whatever his other faults, a man of more scruple than this household has been inclined to credit him with. But Lady Eleanor—" and here Holmes turned, with a gentleness that surprised me, toward that lady, who sat rigid in her chair, her composure at last entirely abandoned. "Lady Eleanor came, some months since, to suspect that Bell possessed dangerous knowledge, and became persuaded that he intended, sooner or later, to make use of it. Her fear was not for herself, but for Clara, whose happiness she believed hung upon a secret that might at any moment be exposed. Lady Eleanor's voice, when at last she spoke, was barely audible. I did not mean for Reginald to be harmed. I swear before God I did not." "I believe you," said Holmes gravely. "But fear, once it has taken sufficient hold of a mind otherwise honourable, is capable of leading even the most devoted of mothers into very dark and very desperate paths. You persuaded Mr. Marsh, whose loyalty to this family has always exceeded his judgment, to assist you in a scheme by which Bell might be freed from custody and privately approached, that his silence might be secured before either Sir Reginald or the police discovered what he knew." "He would not be bought," Marsh said miserably, from where he stood near the door. "I went to him myself on Lady Eleanor's behalf and offered him money, and he refused it, and told me plainly he wanted no part in ruining a family that had never done anything but wrong him. And so your scheme, having failed in its object, was none the less already in motion, and could not be recalled. Sir Reginald discovered, in some manner I have not yet fully determined, that the bond had been forged, and confronted the two of you in his study upon the evening of his collapse. He found the practice sheets," Lady Eleanor whispered. "I had been foolish enough to keep them, believing them safely locked away. He came upon them by chance, searching for some other paper entirely, and understood at once what they meant. You entered the study that evening through the conservatory passage, avoiding the corridor and any servant who might observe you, during the 11 minutes in which the household's attention was elsewhere engaged. Mr. Marsh, meanwhile, had already seen to the hall clock that the true duration of your absence from the drawing-room might not be readily calculated. The confrontation that followed, I am satisfied, involved no violence beyond words, but the strain of it, coming upon a man of Sir Reginald's years and temperament, proved sufficient to bring on the collapse from which he has only now begun to recover." "I took the settlement," Lady Eleanor said, her voice breaking at last, "because I believed, in my madness, that if the paper itself no longer existed, the danger to Clara would cease to exist along with it. I see now how foolish, how wicked that belief truly was." Holmes regarded her for a long moment with an expression in which sternness and compassion seemed very strangely mingled. "The forgery itself, I may tell you, required no great skill upon your part, Lady Eleanor, whatever suspicion has fallen upon others in this house. Sir Reginald's true signature, preserved upon an old sheet of blotting paper taken from his own desk, furnished a mechanical means of tracing his hand with a perfection that no forger's skill, however practised, could ever hope to equal unaided. It was that very perfection, indeed, which first told me the bond had not been forged in the ordinary sense at all, but reproduced by a method requiring patience rather than artistry." He paused and looked slowly about the room, at Major Vale's stricken but unmistakably relieved countenance, at Julian's white and troubled face, at Clara's silent tears. "I think you will all perceive now the essential error that has governed this entire investigation from its earliest hour. We assumed, as investigators commonly do, that men and women falsified documents in order to obtain something — money, property, advantage. But in this case, Lady Eleanor sought to acquire nothing whatsoever. She sought only to prevent something from being taken away, something that existed nowhere upon any legal document, and yet meant more to her than any fortune this family possesses. She sought to preserve, at whatever cost, her daughter's place within a name that fear alone had persuaded her could not survive the truth. "Status," said Sir Reginald quietly from his pillows, speaking for the first time since the recital had begun. "You mean status, Mr. Holmes, and nothing more." "I mean precisely that, Sir Reginald, and I would suggest to you, with all respect, that it is a commodity a good deal less substantial and a good deal more dangerous to guard than either wealth or property could ever be." Chapter 10. A Different Inheritance. The weeks that followed Holmes's reconstruction of the affair at Ashcombe Hall were, I think, among the most difficult that household had ever known, and yet I have seldom seen a family emerge from such trial with so much of genuine worth preserved amid the wreckage of what had been lost. Sir Reginald's recovery, though slow, proceeded steadily once the burden of uncertainty had been lifted from him, and I visited Ashcombe Hall twice more in a professional capacity before I could pronounce him entirely out of danger. It was upon the second of these visits that he spoke to me, with a frankness I had not expected from so reserved a man, of the decision he had reached regarding his sister-in-law. "I have spent the better part of my life, Doctor, believing that the Harcourt name was a thing to be guarded above every other consideration, above happiness, above honesty, very nearly above life itself. I see now what that belief has very nearly cost me, and I have no intention of compounding the error by demanding a second sacrifice to preserve appearances that were never worth the preserving." The legal consequences of what had occurred proved, as such matters generally do, a good deal more complicated than the moral reckoning. Arthur Bell, it was established beyond any reasonable doubt, had attempted no blackmail whatever, and the charge originally brought against him was quietly withdrawn, though I understood from Holmes that Sir Reginald had privately seen to it that some measure of compensation, and even a character reference of sorts, found its way to the unfortunate man's lodgings before the month was out. Major Vale, for his part, was entirely cleared of any complicity in the forgery, though he bore, I think, a certain wounded dignity from the episode that time alone would heal, and he departed Ashcombe Hall within the fortnight, having accepted with evident reluctance that his debts must be settled through his own exertions rather than his cousin's generosity. The missing settlement itself was recovered, quite undamaged, from among Lady Eleanor's own effects, where she had kept it, unable in the end to bring herself to its destruction, a hesitation that Holmes remarked upon to me as the one act of genuine conscience in an otherwise wretched business. She could forge a scheme, Watson, and she could deceive a household, but she could not, when it came to the final act, bring herself to destroy a piece of paper that represented, however painfully, the truth of her daughter's own history. There is something in that hesitation, I think, worth a great deal more than the crime itself was worth condemning. As for Marsh, the law could not so readily overlook a forgery so deliberately executed, whatever the sympathy his motives might command, and he faced the consequences of his actions before the assizes, though Sir Reginald appeared himself, at no small cost to his own dignity, to speak in mitigation of a loyalty that had been, in his own words, misdirected rather than corrupt. The sentence that followed was, in consequence, a good deal lighter than might otherwise have fallen, and I understand that Marsh, upon his eventual release, found employment in a distant county, where the name of Harcourt carried no particular weight, and where, I hope, he has since found some measure of the peace his conscience had so long denied him. Lady Eleanor's own position proved the most delicate of all to resolve. There could be no question of criminal proceedings against a woman whose crime, in the strict language of the law, amounted to little more than complicity in a forgery she had not herself executed, and Sir Reginald, true to the resolve he had confided to me, refused absolutely to permit her banishment from the family, whatever whispers might circulate among their wider acquaintance. She acted out of a mother's terror, Doctor, however wrongly, and I'll not add to her punishment by casting her out to satisfy the world's notion of what a respectable family ought to do with its disgraces. We have had quite enough, in this house, of doing things for the world's benefit rather than our own. It was Clara, I think, who bore the truth with the greatest natural grace of anyone in that troubled household. I called upon her in the course of my final visit, and found her walking in the garden with a young man I understood to be her fiancé, and though her countenance still carried something of the gravity the whole affair had etched upon it, there was in her manner none of the dread I had observed during our earlier interviews. "I have told Henry everything, Dr. Watson," she said simply, when I ventured some careful inquiry after her spirits. "Every particular of it, exactly as Mr. Holmes explained it to us, and he tells me it changes nothing whatever in his regard for me, save perhaps to deepen it, for he says a woman who can bear such a discovery with courage is worth a great deal more than one who has never been tested at all. I confess I found myself, upon hearing this, considerably more moved than my professional composure generally permits, and I said as much to Holmes upon my return to Baker Street, where I found him once more established in his old chair by the fire, his pipe drawing contentedly, the whole grim business of Ashcombe Hall already receding, in his own restless mind, before the promise of some fresh problem. "You are sentimental this evening, Watson," said he, though not unkindly, when I had finished my account of the young couple in the garden. "I do not condemn you for it. It is, I think, the more valuable half of our partnership, that you should feel what I am generally too occupied in reasoning to notice. And yet you cannot deny, Holmes, that the outcome, whatever pain preceded it, has proven a happier one than the case's opening chapters gave any reason to expect. I do not deny it. I will confess indeed that I derive a particular satisfaction from cases of this character, where the truth, once uncovered, proves less destructive than the falsehood it replaces." He drew reflectively upon his pipe, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "You suggested to me, Watson, upon the train homeward, that I had very nearly destroyed one of England's oldest families in the pursuit of a forged bail bond. I own I did think something of the kind, though I am glad to say the event has proved me wrong. You were wrong, my dear fellow, though your error was a natural one. I have not destroyed the Harcourts. The estate remains precisely as it stood before ever Julian Harcourt climbed our staircase upon that wet November evening. The family, whatever its private griefs, remains equally intact, and I venture to think a good deal more honestly bound together than it was before this whole unhappy business began. Only the illusion has been destroyed, Watson, the fiction that a name, however ancient, however carefully guarded, is worth more than the truth of the people who bear it." He fell silent for a time, and I did not disturb his reflection, content merely to sit in the familiar comfort of our sitting-room, the fog pressing once more against our windows as it had done upon that first evening when Julian Harcourt's anxious footstep had first sounded upon our stair. "An inheritance founded upon truth, Watson," Holmes said at last very quietly, as though the thought had only that moment fully formed itself within his mind, "is a good deal more secure, I think, than one preserved by fear. Sir Reginald spent 30 years guarding a name against the world's censure, and very nearly lost everything he sought to protect in the guarding of it. I wonder how many families, in how many quiet country houses across this kingdom of ours, labour under the same mistaken belief, and count themselves fortunate never to have been tested as the Harcourts were tested this autumn. It was, I think, as fitting an epitaph as that strange and melancholy case could have received, and I have set it down here in these pages exactly as Holmes spoke it, believing that in it lies the truest moral of the whole affair, a moral, I may add, that the great detective himself, for all his professed indifference to sentiment, had understood a good deal more deeply than he was ever inclined to admit.